"You're nothing but dead weight." Those were the final words Trent threw at Sadie before he yanked the zipper on his knockoff leather duffel bag. She was 24, drowning in overdue electric bills and scrubbing industrial vats just to keep the radiator sputtering. He called her useless. He called her broke. He didn't know, and honestly neither did she, that a random cheek swab taken for $50 was about to shatter their reality. Sadie wasn't just a maid. She was a Carmichael. Trent packed his things with the frantic, jerky movements of a man trying to outrun his own guilt. He grabbed his protein powder, his 2 decent dress shirts, and the gaming console Sadie had bought him for his birthday, shoving them all into the bag. The zipper snagged on a stray charging cable. He swore, yanking at it until the cheap metal teeth popped. Sadie sat on the edge of their mattress, her weight pressing into a broken spring that had been digging into her left thigh for 6 months. She didn't say anything. She just watched him. The room smelled of his cheap aerosol body spray, a harsh peppery scent meant to mask the smell of old beer and unwashed denim. "You're not even going to say anything," Trent demanded, turning to face her. His jaw was clenched. He was wearing a shirt that belonged in a boardroom, but it was wrinkled at the hem. He was always chasing the next big hustle, the next crypto wave, the next drop-shipping empire. Sadie was the one who paid for the groceries while he built his portfolio. "What do you want me to say?" Sadie asked. Her voice was flat. The fight had drained out of her hours ago, leaving a hollow, echoing sensation behind her ribs. "Say that you understand," he snapped, pointing a finger at her. "I'm 26, Sadie. I have potential. I have a network. I can't be tied down to someone who's perfectly fine making minimum wage for the rest of her life. You have no drive. You're useless in a crisis and you're broke. You're an anchor, and I can't drown with you." The words didn't sting like they should have. They felt heavy like wet sand, but they didn't pierce. She looked down at her hands. Her knuckles were cracked and red, the cuticles peeling from exposure to industrial-grade degreasers. She earned her money. It wasn't much, but it was real. Trent's money lived entirely in spreadsheets and promises. He waited for a reaction. A tear, a scream, a plea for him to stay. When she simply folded her raw hands in her lap, he let out a sharp, disgusted exhale, grabbed his ruined bag, and walked out. The hollow thud of the hollow-core apartment door shutting behind him vibrated through the thin floorboards. She sat there for another 20 minutes. A siren wailed a few blocks over. The radiator hissed, spitting a few drops of rusty water onto the warped linoleum. Then she stood up, walked into the cramped bathroom, and splashed cold water on her face. She had the early shift tomorrow. Heartbreak didn't pay the rent. Dawn tasted like copper and stale coffee. Sadie caught the 5:15 a.m. bus, sitting in the very back where the heater blasted inconsistently. The windows were fogged over with condensation and the collective breath of exhausted commuters. She leaned her forehead against the cool, vibrating glass. Her destination was Apex Commercial Laundry, a massive corrugated metal warehouse squatting on the edge of the city's industrial district. Inside it was a humid purgatory. The air was thick with cotton lint and the eye-watering stench of industrial bleach. Giant steel drums, large enough to hold a compact car, churned relentlessly, washing the linens of the city's hospitals, budget hotels, and chain restaurants. Sadie worked the sorting line. It was mindless, grueling labor. She stood on a rubber mat that offered zero support, grabbing wet, heavy, tangled sheets from a massive bin and feeding them onto a conveyor belt. The heat was oppressive, sticking her uniform to her spine within the first 10 minutes of her shift. Her supervisor, a broad-shouldered woman named Rita, with a raspy voice from 30 years of smoking, walked down the line holding a clipboard. "Keep the pace, Sadie," Rita barked, though not unkindly. "Hotel district had a convention. We're backed up." "I'm on it," Sadie muttered, hoisting another mass of damp, heavy cotton. Her lower back throbbed. Trent's voice played on a loop in her head over the deafening roar of the machines. Useless, broke, dead weight. She ripped a knotted pillowcase apart with more force than necessary, her fingernails snagging and tearing on a hidden zipper. She hissed in pain, sucking the blood from the tip of her finger. The metallic taste grounded her. Trent was gone. The rent was due in 4 days. She had $82 in her checking account. She didn't have time to mourn a man who resented her for keeping him alive. She fed another sheet into the ironer, the steam billowing up and matting her dark hair against her forehead. The machine roared, swallowing the fabric whole, pressing it flat and spitting it out the other side, clean starched and completely anonymous. She wished she could do the same to her own life, put it through a machine, burn away the grime, and come out flat clean and unbothered on the other side. For the next 8 hours, Sadie became nothing but a pair of hands. Lift, sort, push, repeat. Her mind went mercifully blank. It wasn't until the final buzzer rang a harsh electronic screech that cut through the mechanical hum that she realized she hadn't thought about Trent in over 2 hours. Lint coated the inside of Sadie's throat like a thin layer of felt. It was Tuesday, exactly 1 week since Trent had walked out, and the monotony of her existence had settled back over her like a heavy quilt. She was taking her mandated 15-minute break, sitting on an overturned plastic detergent bucket in the alley behind the warehouse. The air outside was only marginally cooler than inside, smelling of hot asphalt and diesel exhaust from the idling delivery trucks. She was staring blankly at a crack in the pavement when the sound of footsteps broke her trance. Not the heavy rubber-soled thud of a warehouse worker, but the sharp, rhythmic click of leather dress shoes. Sadie looked up. A man was navigating the narrow, trash-strewn alleyway. He looked completely absurd in this environment. He wore a charcoal suit that was tailored so precisely it seemed to defy gravity. His silver hair was neatly cropped, and he carried a slim, leather briefcase. The harsh afternoon sun caught the subtle glint of a silver tie clip. He stopped a few feet from her. He didn't pinch his nose against the smell of the nearby dumpsters. His face was entirely neutral, yet intensely observant. Sadie Collins, he asked. His voice was smooth, carrying a clipped, educated cadence that belonged in a boardroom, not an alleyway smelling of sour milk. Sadie stayed seated on her bucket. Her cynical brain instantly cataloged the possibilities. Debt collector. That was the only reason a suit came to this side of town. Probably her mother's old hospital bills, finally catching up to her after 5 years. "Who's asking?" she said, wiping a streak of sweat and lint from her forehead with the back of her wrist. "My name is Richard Davies," the man said, offering a crisp, cream-colored business card. Sadie didn't reach for it. "I am the senior legal counsel for the Carmichael family." Sadie stared at him. The name meant something loosely. Carmichael Logistics, Carmichael Tech, the kind of wealth that owned senators and shaped skylines. "You're lost, Mr. Davies," Sadie said dryly. "The country club is about 10 miles north. If you're looking to get your yacht sails washed, you have to go through the front office." Davies didn't blink. He lowered the card, but didn't put it away. "I assure you I am exactly where I intend to be. 2 years ago, you submitted a DNA sample to a university research program studying genetic markers in low-income populations." Sadie frowned. She remembered that. They had offered a $50 grocery gift card for a cheek swab. She had been living off ramen for a week. She would have given them a kidney for $50 at the time. So, the data from that study was recently acquired by a private medical database. A routine sweep flagged an anomaly. Davies continued, his tone methodical. "A direct familial match." "I don't have family," Sadie said, her voice hardening. "My mother died 5 years ago. Father wasn't in the picture." "He wasn't," Davies agreed, "because he did not know you existed. Your mother, I believe, worked as a hospitality contractor at the Grand Resort in the late 90s. Sadie's grip tightened on the edge of her plastic bucket. "Leave my mother out of this. If this is a scam, you picked the wrong mark. I have exactly $12 in my pocket." "It is not a scam, Miss Collins. Your biological father is Richard Carmichael." Davies finally let the silence hang, allowing the impossible words to settle into the suffocating alley heat. He has been searching for an heir for a decade. The match is conclusive. Sadie looked from the impeccably dressed lawyer to the rusted dumpster, overflowing with bleach bottles, and then down at her own ruined raw hands. The contradiction was so violent it almost made her nauseous. Billionaires didn't have daughters scrubbing industrial laundry vats. It belonged in a cheap soap opera, not in an alley smelling of diesel. "I have to get back to the line," Sadie said, standing up. Her knees popped. "My break is over. If I'm late, Rita will dock my pay." Davies stepped into her path. It wasn't an aggressive movement, but it was unyielding. "Ms. Collins, you do not need to return to the line. You never need to touch a laundry machine again. A car is waiting out front. Mr. Carmichael wishes to meet you." "Who is going to pay for my missed shift?" She snapped, the frustration finally leaking out. It was a petty, ridiculous thing to ask a man holding the keys to a billion-dollar empire, but her brain was refusing to process the macro scale of what he was saying. She could only see the micro, the lost wages, the rent due on Friday. Davies reached into his inner breast pocket, withdrew a slim silver money clip, and peeled off 5 crisp $100 bills. He held them out. "Will this cover the afternoon?" he asked gently. Sadie stared at the money. It was more than she made in a week. The paper looked too clean. She looked back up at Davies's face. There was no mockery there, only a quiet, patient certainty. She took the bills. The paper felt foreign against her calluses. "Let me get my bag," she whispered. 10 minutes later, Sadie was sitting in the back of a black Maybach. The doors had sealed shut with a heavy, pressurized thud, cutting off the roar of the city outside. The air conditioning was silent and smelled faintly of expensive leather and ozone. She still wore her damp, bleach-stained uniform. She felt like a stain on the immaculate upholstery. She ran a cracked finger over the stitching on the armrest. It didn't disappear. It was real. She closed her eyes. The rhythmic hum of the engine vibrating through the floorboards, and for the first time since Trent called her useless, she let herself take a deep breath. Tires hissed against asphalt, a sound that abruptly shifted to a rhythmic, heavy crunch as the Maybach turned onto a private drive. Sadie stared out the tinted window. Wrought iron gates, slick with fresh black paint, had parted silently to let them through. Beyond them lay an expanse of green, so aggressively manicured it looked synthetic. Ancient oak trees lined the driveway, their branches forming a suffocating leafy tunnel that blocked out the late afternoon sun. Davies sat opposite her reading a tablet. He hadn't spoken since offering her the $500. Sadie appreciated that. She didn't want small talk. Her lower back was staging a riot. A familiar dull throb radiating down her sciatic nerve from hauling wet linens. She smelled of industrial bleach sweat and the cheap synthetic lavender soap from the warehouse dispensers. The car smelled of ozone and unblemished leather. The contrast was a physical weight pressing against her chest. "We are arriving," Davies murmured, tapping the screen of his tablet before sliding it into his briefcase. Gravel gave way to smooth paving stones. The car glided to a halt in front of a sprawling limestone estate. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a museum or a mausoleum. Massive windows reflected the gray sky. A man in a dark uniform opened Sadie's door before she could even reach for the handle. The humid city air rushed back in, but it smelled different here. No diesel, no garbage, just the sharp, clean scent of cut grass and damp earth. She stepped out, her worn-down sneakers slapping awkwardly against the immaculate stone. "Follow me, please," Davies said, leading the way up a short flight of wide, shallow steps. Inside, the silence was absolute. The foyer was a cavern of white marble and dark wood, dominated by a sweeping staircase that belonged in a period drama. Sadie felt a sudden violent urge to turn around and run. This wasn't a lottery win. This was a kidnapping by wealth. Every scuff on her shoes, every frayed thread on her cheap polyester uniform screamed that she was an intruder. Davies bypassed the grand staircase, leading her down a long hallway lined with portraits of stern, pale people who looked like they had never laughed a day in their lives. They stopped in front of a set of heavy double oak doors. Davies knocked twice, a sharp, precise rhythm, and pushed one door open without waiting for an answer. "Mr. Carmichael, Miss Collins is here." Sadie walked in. The room was a library, smelling of old paper lemon furniture polish and a faint, astringent undertone of rubbing alcohol. Behind a massive mahogany desk sat a man who looked like he had been carved out of flint. Richard Carmichael did not look like a warm, long-lost father. He was in his late 60s, his skin papery and pale, stretched tight over high cheekbones. An IV stand stood unobtrusively in the corner, a clear tube snaking under the cuff of his crisp, white dress shirt. He was dying. Sadie saw it instantly. It was the same hollowed-out gray look her mother had carried in her final months. He didn't smile. He just stared at her. His eyes were a startling icy blue, the exact same shade she saw in the mirror every morning. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She had his eyes. "Sit," Richard commanded. His voice was raspy, lacking the smooth polish of his lawyer, but it carried an undeniable gravitational authority. Sadie didn't move immediately. She looked at the plush, velvet-upholstered guest chair opposite his desk. "I'll ruin it. I've been working." Richard's gaze dropped to her clothes, taking in the bleach stains and the damp patches. "Sit down, Sadie. The chair can be replaced. Time cannot." She sat. The velvet yielded under her weight, plush and unforgivingly luxurious. She kept her back straight, refusing to sink into it. "Davies explained the situation?" Richard asked, interlacing his fingers on the desk. They were thin fingers, the knuckles swollen with arthritis, but the nails were perfectly manicured. "He said we matched." Sadie replied, her voice steady, despite the frantic drumming of her pulse. "He said you were looking for an heir. He didn't say why." Richard's mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile exactly, but a brief acknowledgement of her directness. "I am dying. Pancreatic cancer. I have perhaps 6 months. A year if my doctors are feeling optimistic, which they rarely are." He stated it like a quarterly earnings report. Cold, factual. "I'm sorry," Sadie said. She meant it, but only in the abstract way one pities a stranger. She didn't know this man. She only knew the hole his absence had left in her mother's life. "Don't be," Richard said sharply. "Pity is useless. I need a successor. My sister's son, Preston, currently believes he is next in line to take over the board of Carmichael Logistics. Preston is an idiot, a well-dressed, charismatic idiot who will tank the company's stock within a fiscal year to fund his lifestyle." Sadie crossed her arms. Her hands throbbed. "And you think I can run a billion-dollar logistics company? 3 hours ago, I was sorting dirty sheets at a commercial laundry." "You survived," Richard countered, leaning forward slightly. "I had my investigators look into you the moment the match was confirmed. You paid off your mother's medical debt while making minimum wage. You haven't taken out a predatory loan. You navigate crises. You have grit. Preston has a trust fund. I have a high school diploma and a sociopathic ex-boyfriend who just stole my gaming console." Sadie shot back the absurdity of the situation, finally making her temper flare. "I don't know the first thing about logistics." "Logistics is just moving things from point A to point B efficiently," Richard said, waving a hand dismissively. "I can hire tutors to teach you the terminology. I can hire advisors to read the spreadsheets. I cannot hire instinct, and I cannot hire loyalty." He opened a drawer and pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder, sliding it across the polished mahogany. "You are my daughter. The press will have a field day, but the board will have to accept you as the majority shareholder once I am gone. But you have to survive the transition." He looked her dead in the eye. "It will be brutal. They will look at you exactly as you look at yourself right now, as a stain on the upholstery. Are you going to let them scrub you out?" Sadie looked at the folder. Her name was printed on the tab. Sadie Carmichael. It looked wrong. But then she thought of Trent. She thought of his sneer as he zipped up his cheap bag. "You're an anchor." She reached out with her raw, cracked hand and pulled the folder toward her. "Where do I start?" Water rained down from a brass showerhead, the size of a dinner plate. Sadie stood perfectly still under the scalding spray, watching the water turn a faint, muddy gray as it circled the drain. The bathroom she had been directed to was larger than her entire apartment. It smelled of eucalyptus and expensive stone. She scrubbed her skin with a loofah that felt like crushed velvet, using a body wash that smelled of bergamot and cedar. She scrubbed until her skin was violently pink, trying to scrape off the lingering scent of industrial bleach and aerosol body spray. She wanted to wash off Trent. She wanted to wash off Rita's yelling, the rattling bus rides, the persistent low-level panic of an empty checking account. But as she stepped out of the glass enclosure and wrapped herself in a towel thicker than a winter coat, the panic didn't wash down the drain. It just mutated. Instead of worrying about eviction, she was now worrying about corporate sabotage and a dying billionaire who expected her to become a titan of industry overnight. She wiped the steam from the massive mirror over the vanity. Her face looked the same, dark hair plastered to her skull, pale skin, blue eyes. She didn't look rich. She looked exhausted. A sharp knock at the bedroom door made her jump. "Ms. Collins," a woman's voice called out. "I have clothing for you." Sadie opened the bathroom door slightly. "Just leave it on the bed, please." When she finally emerged, the bedroom was empty. On the massive four-poster bed lay a pair of tailored black trousers, a silk cream blouse, and a soft cashmere cardigan. No tags. Everything felt alarmingly soft. Beside the clothes was a pair of black leather loafers. She dressed quickly. The clothes fit perfectly. Richard's investigators hadn't just looked at her bank accounts. They had apparently acquired her measurements. The silk was cool against her skin, a stark contrast to the stiff, scratchy polyester she had worn for the last 3 years. She felt like she was wearing a disguise. She felt dangerous. Another knock. This time Davies stood in the hallway. He looked her up and down, his expression remaining perfectly neutral. "Dinner will be served in the minor dining room in 20 minutes, he announced. "Mr. Carmichael will not be joining you. He is resting. However, you will not be dining alone." Sadie paused, her hand hovering over the doorknob. "Who else is here?" "Your cousin Preston. He was informed of your existence approximately an hour ago. He chose to drive over immediately." Davies adjusted his cuffs. "I suggest you prepare yourself, Ms. Collins. He is not pleased." Sadie's jaw tightened. "Call me Sadie." "Very well, Sadie. Follow me." The minor dining room was still large enough to comfortably host 20 people. A long mahogany table stretched across a Persian rug that looked older than the country itself. The air smelled of roasted garlic, rosemary, and the sharp tang of expensive red wine. At the far end of the table sat a man in his early 30s. He wore a navy blazer over a crisp, open-collared shirt. He had thick, styled hair and a jawline that looked like it had been bought and paid for. He was swirling a glass of wine, staring at the dark red liquid as if it held the secrets to the universe. As Sadie walked in, he didn't stand. He didn't even look up immediately. He took a slow sip, swallowed, and then finally raised his eyes. They were dark, assessing, and utterly hostile. "So," Preston said, his voice dripping with practiced condescension, "the miracle child arrives." Sadie didn't take the seat at the opposite end of the table. That would put miles between them. Instead, she walked down the length of the room and pulled out the chair directly to his right. She sat down, ignoring the slight widening of his eyes at her proximity. She placed her hands flat on the table. The raw, cracked cuticles stood out aggressively against the pristine white tablecloth. "Preston Wright," she said, keeping her voice flat. He offered a tight, patronizing smile. "You must be overwhelmed. It's a lot to take in." The house, the money, the forks. He gestured vaguely to the complicated array of silverware beside her empty plate. I suppose Richard told you some grandiose fairy tale about you taking over the company. He told me you were an idiot who would tank the stock, Sadie replied. She didn't raise her voice. She delivered the insult with the same deadpan tone she used to tell Rita the sorting machine was jammed. Preston's smile vanished. The glass in his hand halted its swirling. A muscle feathered in his jaw. Listen to me, you little gutter rat. I don't care what piece of paper Richard signed or what delusion he's suffering from in his final days. I have spent 10 years building relationships with the board. I know the suppliers. I know the shipping routes. You don't even know how to use a finger bowl. He leaned in, the smell of expensive cologne and sour wine washing over her. Take whatever payout Davies offers you. Go buy a nice house in the suburbs. Buy a boat, but if you try to step into Carmichael Logistics, I will humiliate you so thoroughly you won't be able to show your face in public again. Sadie didn't flinch. She looked at his soft, manicured hands. She thought about Trent yelling at her about his potential while she paid the electric bill. Preston was just another version of Trent, wrapped in a more expensive suit. Entitled, arrogant, weak. Did you know, Sadie started, her voice barely above a whisper, that industrial bleach burns through the top layer of your epidermis in about 40 seconds if you don't rinse it off? Preston frowned, thrown off balance by the non sequitur. What? I know what burns, Sadie said, looking up from his hands to his eyes. The icy blue of her father's gaze locked onto Preston's dark ones. I know what it takes to survive when nobody is writing checks to cover your mistakes. You know the board. That's great. But you've never been hungry a day in your life, Preston. She picked up the crystal water goblet in front of her, the heavy glass cool against her palm. I'm not here for a payout, she said smoothly, taking a slow sip. She placed the glass back down precisely on its coaster. I'm here for everything. Pass the rolls, would you? 3 weeks blurred into a punishing cycle of caffeine high-thread count sheets and the blinding glare of iPad screens. Sadie quickly learned that corporate exhaustion was entirely different from physical fatigue. At the laundry warehouse, her body would shut down, demanding sleep the second her head hit the mattress. Here in the Carmichael estate, her body was perfectly rested, but her brain hummed with a frantic, vibrating panic that kept her staring at the molded plaster ceiling until 3 a.m. Numbers didn't bleed, they didn't smell like bleach, and they didn't tear your cuticles, but they were infinitely more dangerous. Davies had transformed from an emissary into a ruthless drill sergeant. Every morning at 7 a.m., he waited in the minor dining room with a stack of dossiers. He didn't care that she didn't know an EBITDA from an ETF. He forced her to read supply chain manifests, quarterly loss reports, and fuel expenditure spreadsheets until the columns of black text looked like swarming ants. You are reading the words, Sadie, but you are not seeing the system, Davies said on a rainy Tuesday morning. He tapped a manicured fingernail against a laminated map of North American shipping routes. Look at the Chicago hub. Why is the turnaround time dropping? Sadie rubbed her eyes. The skin around them felt bruised. She was wearing a cashmere sweater that cost more than her last car, but she still felt cold. Because the new routing software is inefficient, she recited, parroting the summary report Preston had filed 2 days prior. Wrong, Davies snapped, snapping the folder shut. The sound echoed in the quiet room. That is what Preston wants the board to believe because he approved the software contract and gets a kickback from the developer. Look at the raw data. The warehouse. What is actually happening? She pulled the thick stack of paper toward her. Her fingers felt strange. The deep, rough calluses from hauling wet laundry were beginning to peel away, leaving behind sensitive, raw, pink skin. She hated it. It felt like she was losing her armor. She stared at the numbers. Turnaround times. Truck arrivals. Docking bay schedules. Staffing rosters. Her eyes caught on a column listing employee ID numbers and shift hours. She tracked the numbers across the week. A low, familiar hum of recognition started in her chest. "They're running a skeleton crew on the third shift," Sadie murmured, leaning closer to the paper. "Look right here. Between midnight and 6 a.m., they've cut floor staff by 40%. But the freight volume hasn't dropped. The trucks are still arriving." Davies didn't say anything. He just watched her. "The software isn't the bottleneck," Sadie continued, her voice gaining traction. "The dock workers are. You can have the best routing algorithm in the world, but if you only have 3 guys unloading a 53-foot trailer instead of 6, the truck sits idle. The drivers time out of their legal driving hours. The whole schedule backs up." She looked up at Davies. The lawyer offered a microscopic, tight-lipped nod. "You know what a tired crew does?" Sadie asked, leaning back in her chair. "They cut corners. They throw boxes instead of stacking them. Shrinkage goes up. Breakages go up. And eventually, someone gets a forklift tine through their foot, and then you're paying workers' comp instead of overtime." "Precisely," Davies said. He poured himself a cup of black coffee from the silver carafe on the table. "Preston views the workforce as an abstract expense to be minimized. You view them as the physical engine of the company. Never lose that perspective. It is the only advantage you have." Her cheap, battered cell phone vibrated violently against the mahogany table. It was a jarring sound in the quiet room. She had refused to let Richard buy her a new one. It was her one tether to reality. She glanced at the cracked screen. The caller ID flashed Trent. Her stomach violently contracted. It was a physical lurch, a sudden rush of cold acid. He hadn't called in a month, not since he packed his bags and called her an anchor. She stared at the vibrating plastic, her heart hammering against her ribs. And do you need to take that?" Davies asked politely, though his eyes missed nothing. "No," Sadie said. Her voice was slightly hoarse. She pressed the red button, sending the call to voicemail. 10 seconds later, a text popped up. Saw the Bloomberg article. "Wara Carmichael. Seriously, we need to talk. I miss you." A harsh, ugly laugh scraped its way out of her throat. It wasn't a sound of triumph. It was purely cynical. She had spent 2 years paying this man's phone bill, buying his groceries, listening to him talk about his supposed genius while she scrubbed vats. $1 billion hadn't made her smarter, or prettier, or more worthy of love. It had just made her a target. She picked up the phone, blocked the number, and dropped the device into the pocket of her slacks. She didn't feel empowered. She just felt deeply, exhaustingly sad. "Let's move on to the Atlanta depot," Sadie said, pulling the next file forward. "If Preston is gutting the floor staff there too, we need to know before the quarterly meeting on Thursday." Air conditioning in the Carmichael Logistics boardroom hummed at a frequency designed to keep people awake and slightly uncomfortable. The room was located on the 42nd floor of a glass and steel obelisk in the financial district. The table was a massive slab of polished black granite. Sitting around it were 12 men and 3 women who collectively controlled the movement of millions of tons of freight across the globe. Sadie sat near the end of the table. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that felt restrictive across her shoulders. Her hair was pulled back into a severe knot. She had been introduced 30 minutes ago by Richard's proxy, a senior board member named Stanton. The reception had been exactly as cold as she expected. Polite nods, thin smiles, eyes that darted to her unpolished nails, and the slight nervous tremor in her left hand. Preston stood at the head of the table, commanding the room with effortless predatory grace. He wore a lighter blue suit that shouldn't have worked in a boardroom, but on him, it projected utter confidence. He was currently navigating a complex slide deck regarding the Midwest routing delays. "As you can see," Preston said, clicking a laser pointer at a bar graph that plummeted sharply, "the integration of the Apex logistics software has resulted in temporary friction at our Chicago and Detroit hubs. It's a learning curve. The algorithms require time to map the optimal dock-to-door ratios. I project normalization by Q3. Stanton, an older man with a bristling white mustache, frowned. "We are hemorrhaging clients to Swift Freight Preston. Temporary friction is costing us $40 million a month. The drivers are threatening a walkout over the wait times. Driver complaints are a constant, Stanton, Preston said smoothly, dismissing the concern with a wave of his hand. They resist automation. Once the system overrides human error in the scheduling, the wait times will drop. Sadie stared at the graph on the screen. It was identical to the data Davies had shown her. She felt a bead of sweat prickle at her hairline. She was out of her depth. She didn't have an MBA. She didn't know the etiquette of interjecting, but she knew the smell of an exhausted warehouse, and she knew Preston was lying. Her heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against her breastbone. "You're an anchor," Trent's voice whispered in her memory. "Useless in a crisis." Sadie placed her hands flat on the cold granite. She took a breath. "It's not the software," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but the sheer novelty of her speaking cut through the room's low murmur. 15 heads turned to look at her. Preston's smile froze, turning brittle. "I'm sorry, Sadie," Preston said, his tone dripping with paternalistic patience. "I know this is your first week looking at macro-level logistics, but the data clearly shows, you cut the third-shift floor staff by 40%. Sadie interrupted. Her voice shook slightly on the first syllable, but she forced it steady. She didn't look at Preston. She looked directly at Stanton. You can't automate unloading a disorganized pallet. The trucks are sitting in the bays because there are only 3 men running the forklifts instead of 6. The drivers are timing out." A heavy, oppressive silence fell over the granite table. "That is an operational adjustment to optimize labor costs," Preston said, his voice dropping an octave, a clear warning. "The software is designed to handle the flow." "The software doesn't sweat." Sadie shot back, the blue-collar frustration finally bleeding through her tailored suit. "The software doesn't have to break down a mixed pallet of industrial chemicals when a supplier stacks it wrong. You gutted the overnight crew to make your quarterly labor expenses look lean, and now it's bottlenecking the entire Midwest corridor." She reached for the tablet embedded in the table in front of her, her fingers flying over the glass as she pulled up the unedited staffing manifests Davies had provided. She swiped upward, casting the document onto the main screen, side by side, with Preston's sanitized graph. "Look at the incident reports." Sadie pointed at the screen. "Forklift accidents are up 22% in Chicago. Breakages are up 15%. The crew is exhausted. They are rushing. You aren't saving money on labor, Preston. You're just paying for it in ruined freight and lost contracts." Stanton leaned forward, pulling his reading glasses down his nose as he scrutinized the new data. "Is this accurate, Preston? You authorized a 40% reduction in the overnight loading crew." Preston's face flushed a dull, ugly red. "It was a beta test for the new efficiency standards. If the floor managers were competent, if the floor managers had the bodies, the freight would move," Sadie said. She felt a sudden, fierce clarity. This wasn't corporate warfare. This was common sense. It was the exact same logic she used when Rita yelled at her for falling behind on the sorting line when 2 machines were broken. You can't squeeze blood from a stone, and you can't squeeze 100 tons of freight through a broken system. "Restore the third shift headcount," Sadie said, looking around the table, meeting the eyes of the board members one by one. She was no longer trying to shrink into the leather chair. "Pay the penalty to break the Apex software contract. It's useless. Put the money back onto the warehouse floor where it actually moves the needle." Stanton looked from Preston's flushed face to Sadie's pale, determined one. A slow, deeply appreciative smile touched the corners of his mouth beneath the mustache. "Well," Stanton murmured, tapping his pen against his notepad. "It seems Richard's daughter knows how to read a room and a manifest. Adrenaline is a dirty fuel. It burns white-hot in the moment, making your vision sharp and your tongue quick, but it leaves behind a toxic, exhausting residue." Sadie felt the crash the second the Maybach doors sealed her inside, cutting off the polite, shell-shocked murmurs of the executive board. Her hands, steady as stone while she publicly dismantled Preston, were now shaking so violently she had to wedge them under her thighs. She returned to the estate just as the afternoon light turned the color of bruised plums. The silence of the mansion was no longer intimidating. It was suffocating. She bypassed the minor dining room and walked straight upstairs, her heels sinking into the thick carpet. Richard's bedroom was a clinical outpost, disguised as a luxury suite. The smell of lemon polish had been entirely overpowered by the sharp, medicinal sting of rubbing alcohol, iodine, and dying orchids. The rhythmic, synthetic beep of a heart monitor provided a grim metronome for the space. Richard was propped up on a mound of pillows. He looked smaller than he had 3 weeks ago. His skin was the color of old parchment, translucent enough to show the fragile blue road map of veins underneath. But her eyes were still sharp. "Stanton called me," Richard rasped. Speaking clearly cost him breath he couldn't spare. "He said you gutted Preston." In front of the entire steering committee, Sadie stood at the foot of the bed. She didn't feel victorious. She felt like she had just survived a bar fight. "I told them the truth. He was breaking the supply chain to make his spreadsheet look pretty." A dry, rattling sound escaped Richard's chest. It took Sadie a moment to realize it was a laugh. "You bled him, Sadie. You didn't just correct his math. You exposed him as a fraud to the men he spent 10 years courting. He will never recover that authority. I did what needed to be done to get the trucks moving," she said, her tone defensive. "You did exactly what I brought you here to do." Richard corrected, his head sinking deeper into the pillows. "You fought like someone who knows what it costs to lose. Preston only knows what it costs to win." He closed his eyes, the effort of the conversation draining the last reserves of his energy. "You are my daughter." It was the closest thing to affection he had ever offered. Sadie stared at the man in the bed, feeling a strange, hollow ache in her throat. She didn't love him. You can't love a stranger just because you share a genetic sequence. But she understood him, and that realization was terrifying. She turned and walked out, desperate for air that didn't smell like decay. She told the driver to take her downtown. She needed the noise. She needed the concrete. When the car stopped at a red light near the financial district, she unlocked the door and stepped out, ignoring the driver's startled protest. She walked for 6 blocks, letting the humid, exhaust-choked air wash over her. She found a cheap, fluorescent-lit diner, the kind that smelled of old fry grease and scorched coffee. She slid into a vinyl booth that was taped together at the seams and ordered black coffee. She was staring at the muddy liquid when the bell above the door chimed. "Sadie." The voice hit her like a physical blow to the back of the neck. She didn't turn around immediately. Her stomach violently contracted, a Pavlovian response built on 2 years of walking on eggshells. Slowly she turned her head. Trent was standing by the sugar dispenser. He was wearing the pale blue dress shirt she had bought him for an interview he never went to. The collar was slightly frayed. He looked thinner, his posture lacking the arrogant swagger he usually carried. He looked nervous. He slid into the booth across from her without asking. Up close, the illusion of the successful entrepreneur shattered. He smelled of stale beer and that same peppery aerosol spray. There was a desperate, manic gleam in his eyes. "I've been trying to find you," Trent said, leaning forward. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "Your old landlord said you just vanished. Then I saw the Bloomberg piece online, the Carmichael heir. Sadie, I couldn't believe it." "What do you want, Trent?" Sadie asked. Her voice was completely flat. She didn't feel angry. She didn't feel heartbroken, looking at him sitting in the cheap diner light. She just felt a profound, exhausting wave of pity. He looked so small. "I want to apologize," he said quickly, reaching across the table to grab her hand. Sadie pulled her hand back smoothly, leaving his fingers grasping empty air. She wrapped her hands around her coffee mug. "I was stressed," Trent pleaded, his face flushing. "I was out of my mind with the crypto crash. I said things I didn't mean. You know me, Sadie. We built a life together. We were a team. I was trying to push you to be better." "You called me dead weight," she stated. The words didn't hurt anymore. They were just data points. "You called me useless and broke, and you took the console I bought you. I'll bring it back. I'll sell it." he promised frantically. Sadie, look at me. It's me. We had something real. All this money, these corporate suits, they don't know the real you. I do. We can do this together, like we always planned. Sadie looked at him. Really looked at him. She saw the panicked sweat gathering on his upper lip. She saw the way his eyes kept darting to her expensive, tailored jacket. He didn't want her. He wanted the Maybach. He wanted the penthouse. He was a parasite looking for a new host. You don't know me, Trent, Sadie said softly. You knew a girl who was too tired from scrubbing floors to realize she was letting you drown her. That girl doesn't exist anymore. She reached into her purse, pulled out a crisp $20 bill, and laid it on the table. Buy yourself a new shirt, she said, sliding out of the booth. That one is wearing out at the collar. She didn't look back as she walked out into the street. The city noise swallowed the chime of the diner door, and for the first time in her life, Sadie felt completely beautifully weightless. Death did not arrive with a dramatic gasp or final cinematic words. It came at 4:12 a.m. on a rainy Thursday, announced only by the sudden flat electronic tone of the heart monitor. Sadie had been sitting in the armchair in the corner of Richard's room, reviewing a shipping manifest on her tablet. When the machine shrieked, she didn't jump. She simply set the tablet down on the side table, walked over to the bed, and looked at the man who had given her half her DNA and $1 billion war. His face was finally slack. The permanent lines of tension smoothed away. He just looked like a frail, empty vessel. Davies materialized in the doorway 10 minutes later. He wore a dark, impeccably pressed suit, though it was hours before dawn. He didn't offer platitudes. He merely looked at the bed, gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, and turned to Sadie. The transition protocols are initiated, Davies said quietly. The board will be notified at 6 a.m. The press release will go out at 8 a.m. You need to dress. The sharks will smell blood in the water before the sun is up. The funeral was a grotesque pantomime of grief. It rained a cold, relentless drizzle that turned the cemetery grounds into a slick, muddy sponge. Sadie stood under a massive black umbrella held by a security guard. She wore a heavy black wool coat that smelled faintly of mothballs and expensive dry cleaning. Flashbulbs from the paparazzi positioned behind the wrought iron gates popped continuously, strobing against the gray sky. She watched the mahogany casket lower into the earth. She didn't cry. The media would probably call her an ice queen tomorrow. She didn't care. She was mourning, but not for Richard. She was mourning the life she could have had if he had found her 20 years ago, before her mother worked herself into an early grave. She was mourning the sheer brutal unfairness of a world where money could buy a man 5 extra months of life. But lack of it had killed her mother over an unpaid antibiotic prescription. Following the burial, the estate hosted a reception. The house was packed with politicians, rival CEOs, and socialites who spoke in hushed, practiced tones while drinking $1,000 scotch. Sadie stood near the library doors, nursing a glass of sparkling water, enduring the endless parade of handshakes and hollow condolences. Preston finally cornered her just after 3 o'clock. He had clearly been drinking. His face was flushed, and his tie was slightly loosened. He stepped into her personal space, forcing her to back up a half step against the oak paneling. The smell of scotch and sour breath rolled off him. "Oh, enjoying the crown." Preston sneered, his voice low enough to avoid drawing a crowd, but thick with venom. Quite a turnout for a man who didn't give a damn about any of these people. "It's a funeral, Preston," Sadie said, keeping her voice strictly neutral. "Don't make a scene." "A scene?" He let out a harsh, ugly laugh. "The scene is just starting, sweetheart. Do you really think I'm going to let some blue-collar bastard child walk in and take half my inheritance? My lawyers are filing the papers tomorrow. I'm challenging the will, undue influence, mental decline. Richard was out of his mind at the end and you manipulated him." Sadie didn't blink. The panic that would have seized her a month ago was completely absent. She looked at Preston's bloodshot eyes. He wasn't a shark. He was a desperate man, holding a losing hand, trying to bluff. "Challenge it. Sadie said. Her voice was remarkably steady. It didn't waver. It cut through the low hum of the reception like a scalpel. Preston frowned, thrown by her lack of fear. It will tie up your shares in probate for 5 years. You won't see a dime. You'll be back scrubbing toilets before the trial even starts. Davies secured the medical affidavits proving Richard's sound mind 3 weeks ago, signed by 4 independent neurologists. Sadie replied smoothly. And as of 7 a.m. this morning, Stanton and 5 other board members signed irrevocable proxies backing my appointment as interim CEO while the shares transfer. They don't want a prolonged legal battle. They want stability. She took a step forward, forcing Preston to be the one to back away. If you sue, you will lose, Sadie told him, her icy blue eyes locking onto his. You will drain your own trust fund paying legal fees, and when it's over, I will personally ensure the board strips you of your regional directorship. You won't even be allowed to load a truck at the Chicago depot, let alone manage it. Preston's jaw worked silently. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. He had expected the scared girl from the laundry warehouse. He hadn't realized that the warehouse had forged someone uniquely equipped to handle a hostile environment. You're a monster, he whispered. No, Sadie said, taking a sip of her water. I'm an anchor, and you're currently sinking. She turned her back on him and walked toward the center of the room. Davies was waiting near the fireplace, holding a tablet. He looked up as she approached, his expression as unreadable as ever. Stanton is asking for a preliminary meeting tomorrow at 9, Davies murmured, to discuss the third quarter projections. Sadie looked around the room. The polished wood, the expensive suits, the quiet hum of power. It wasn't her world, not really. Part of her would always be the girl on the bus with cracked knuckles, calculating the cost of a carton of eggs. But she owned this room now. She had the ledger, and she was going to balance it. Tell Stanton I'll be there at 8, Sadie said. And Davies, get me a coffee. Black coffee tasted like battery acid on 3 hours of sleep. Sadie swallowed it anyway, letting the bitter heat burn a path down her throat. It was Tuesday, exactly 6 months since they had put Richard in the ground, and the corner office on the 42nd floor still felt less like a sanctuary and more like a sniper's nest. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the city grid. The cars looked like corpuscles moving through concrete veins. She wore a tailored navy blazer, but paired it with heavy, practical leather boots. It was a compromise that horrified her executive stylists, but appeased her own deeply ingrained need to stay anchored to the floor. Davies knocked once and entered without waiting. He placed a slim, black leather-bound folio on her desk. The severance paperwork for Preston, Davies announced. His voice was as crisp and unbothered as it had been in the alleyway behind the commercial laundry. He signed. The non-disclosure agreements are locked in. He surrendered his board seat effective at midnight. Sadie turned around. She didn't feel a rush of euphoric triumph. She just felt a dull, pragmatic relief. Did he try to negotiate the buyout? No. He attempted to demand his stock options vest immediately. Davies replied, a ghost of a smirk, finally touching his thin lips. I gently reminded him of the forensic accounting report detailing his kickbacks from the Apex software deal. He signed the standard exit package shortly after. Good. Lock his key cards and wipe his corporate servers. Sadie walked over to the desk, running a hand over the smooth, cold mahogany. What's next on the docket? Your site visit, the Newark distribution hub. Jackson, the regional manager, has been pacing the loading docks since dawn. An hour later, the Maybach pulled into an industrial park that looked painfully familiar. The transition from the sterile ozone-scented air of the corporate vehicle to the reality of the logistics hub was a physical shock. As Sadie stepped out, the noise hit her with the force of a solid object. The pneumatic shriek of air breaks the heavy, bone-rattling thud of pallets dropping onto concrete, the relentless, piercing reverse alarms of 20 different forklifts operating simultaneously. It smelled of diesel fumes, damp corrugated cardboard, and the metallic tang of hot engine oil. It was chaotic, loud, and brutally unglamorous. Sadie breathed it in, her shoulders tight since the board meeting yesterday, dropped an inch. Jackson, a burly man with a high-vis vest stretched tight over his chest, hurried over. He was sweating profusely, despite the biting chill in the autumn air. "Ms. Carmichael," Jackson said, wiping a thick hand on his trousers before offering it. "We're honored. The floor is running at 92% efficiency today." Sadie shook his hand. His palm was rough, heavy, and calloused. "Real." "Let's walk, Jackson. Show me the outbound lanes." They navigated the narrow concrete aisles between towering steel racks. Sadie didn't look at the sanitized spreadsheets Jackson tried to hand her. She looked at the people. She watched a loader wrestling a top-heavy pallet of industrial solvent. The thin plastic shrink wrap was tearing. The loader was using his bare hands, his knuckles white raw and scraped. Sadie stopped dead. "Jackson, why isn't he wearing gloves?" Jackson blinked, thrown by the fiercely specific question. The company issue gloves are up front in the break room. Cotton ones. The guys say they slip on the shrink wrap, so they prefer bare hands for the heavy stuff. Grip is better." Sadie looked at the loader's hands. She remembered the stinging, agonizing burn of chemical bleach in an open cut. She remembered the sheer indignity of bleeding for a company that didn't even know your employee ID number. "Cotton is useless for freight," Sadie said flatly. She turned to Davies, who was shadowing them seamlessly with his tablet ready. "Davies, terminate the current PPE vendor contract. I want Kevlar-lined rubber grip impact gloves issued to every floor worker in the network by the end of the month." Jackson's eyes widened in alarm. "Miss Carmichael, with respect, those cost $40 a pair. We have 3,000 floor workers. And last quarter we paid out over $2 million in workers' comp for crush injuries and lacerations on the loading docks." Sadie shot back, her tone brooking absolutely no argument. "The gloves pay for themselves in 6 weeks. Order them." She didn't do it because she was a saint. She did it because broken hands couldn't move boxes, and moving boxes equaled revenue. It was cynical, brutal math, but it was math that put armor on the people doing the bleeding. That was the difference between her and Preston. Preston saw human labor as a frustrating line item to be erased by software. Sadie saw them as the only physical foundation keeping the entire multi-billion-dollar building from collapsing. As they continued the tour, the news of the glove order rippled down the loading line faster than any corporate memo. The stares she received shifted. The workers weren't looking at a billionaire interloper anymore. They were looking at someone who understood the actual weight of a pallet. By the time she returned to her corner office, the sun was sinking, casting long, bruised shadows across the city skyline. Sadie sat in her leather chair and pulled up her personal banking app on her phone. The balance was a number so large, it looked fundamentally fake. 9 figures. It didn't fix the lingering ache in her lower sciatic nerve. It didn't bring her mother back. It didn't erase the memory of Trent packing his cheap duffel bag and calling her dead weight. Just yesterday, Stanton had mentioned entirely in passing that Trent had been seen working the graveyard shift at a suburban toll booth. Stanton had offered to have him removed from the city limits, assuming Sadie wanted some form of theatrical revenge. She had declined. Revenge required emotional investment, and Trent wasn't worth the calories it took to hate him. He was a parasite that had finally detached itself, and she was absolutely done feeding ghosts. Sadie locked her phone and set it face down on the desk. The city lights began to flicker on millions of tiny bulbs, fighting back the encroaching dark. She was tired, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that no amount of high-thread count sheets could cure. But as she looked at the glowing supply chain maps on her massive monitors, green lines pulsing steadily across the continent, moving food, medicine, and steel, she felt something else beneath the fatigue. She felt solid, unmovable. She wasn't a fairy tale princess, rescued from the ashes by a benevolent king. She was the one who managed the fire. She reached for the next stack of operational reports, picked up a heavy silver pen, and went to work. Power isn't about the name on the building. It's about knowing the exact cost of the sweat that keeps it running. Sadie didn't just inherit an empire, she weaponized her survival. If you felt the justice in Sadie's quiet, brutal rise to the top, hit that like button. Share this story with anyone who's ever been underestimated or called dead weight by someone too blind to see their grit. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next deep dive into stories of resilience and redemption. Drop a comment below. What's the first thing you'd change if you took over a billionaire's boardroom?